Hey everyone, today on Amaranth Bay we will be building up the industrial zone with a mix of historic factories, modern industries, and a couple of office buildings. We're going to start with the historic core of the industrial zone. There's nothing quite like this in Duluth, at least in the Rice's Point area, but I did see an interesting spot in Milwaukee that had kind of the look I was going for, so I used that as a bit of a template to work off of. I put down some historic wall-to-wall factories and warehouses that would have been built here maybe alongside the original development of the port, or probably a bit more likely sometime after that, but still in the pre-war period, so you get these older styles of buildings. There aren't too many of these because I figured that random industrial structures wouldn't be as high of a priority from a preservationist's point of view, so many of these would have been torn down and replaced with newer things, but I did want to have some historic remnants. Where old buildings have been demolished, you get some more modern buildings that are a mix of light industry and offices, including this big one up in the corner, which has gobbled up a good 3 or 4 lots and the entire width of the alley as well, with this kind of warehouse with the sloped roof. I wanted to make the buildings along the main avenue look a bit more prosperous and presentable and just busier than the ones on the other side of the alley, with the idea being that these would mostly be offices or maybe factories that have like attached storefronts. So you'd naturally find the more recent and more successful businesses along here, whether they're in the new buildings or in the historic buildings. And of course, you'll get some attached parking lots in some of these old lots as well, which seems to be something you see in these old wall-to-wall areas quite frequently. Although I do have to ask why anyone would even use these, given that there's a streetcar stop literally right there, just saying. I think one of the most interesting challenges of the build was making all the little lots and driveways and things that are attached to each of these buildings, or at least the more heavily industrial ones. I generally used the assets themselves to set up the logic for these kinds of things, so I tried to work with built-in doors and garages and all that to make sure that they have access to the outside world in a reasonable way. And then from there, I added the usual sorts of industrial details like fences and pallets and dumpsters and signs and all that kind of stuff that you would see scattered around an industrial zone. I think that approaching the build this way really helped me figure out the proper spacing for each building in a way that I just normally don't focus on. And I think that's important when you're building an industrial zone, because a lot of the work when you're doing industrial things, at least presumably, is going to be going on outside because you need lots of space to maneuver trucks and trailers and big pieces of equipment and that sort of stuff. Of course, not in every case, but in general, I think it really helped boost up the realism a little bit, or at least I hope that's the case. This big factory over here was a little bit of a weird build because the whole thing is up against the road, which kind of goes against what I said before with having like big lots around these kinds of buildings, but there is space over here to provide access off of the old cross street. The only problem with that is that these buildings were all smushed up with PO, so the built-in doors did not look good. So what I did was I took another copy of the building, turned it into a PO, and just added my own garage doors in. And then I was able to detail up a little lot around here. I'm not trying to overload it with stuff at this point. I just wanted to look a little bit believable and give it a little bit of life. And of course, to restore functionality here, I also added in an industrial block so we can get some traffic and some production. Like I mentioned before, I wanted the area on this side of the alley to be struggling a bit, so I decided to add a few vacant lots as we go through this build. I tried using a couple of different techniques, with one being a mishmash of various decals, and the other was to use this single giant decal and just pare it back with PO to fit into the block and get a nice clean cut along the sidewalk. And I think both techniques work pretty well. They look different. I think this one looks a little bit more overgrown and older, and the other one looks a little bit more recent. So we'll be continuing to use both of those in this build. Moving one block over, we have this big intersection where the main avenue connects up with this 4-lane road that runs over to the public port terminal. I figured that these two plots of land on either side of the cross street would be the most valuable out of all of these because they're at a major intersection. So to represent that, both blocks are going to get completely new office building developments. For this block, I used kind of a weird layout where you have the gray office building in an L shape on one side, and then this smaller brick building attached to it on the other side. But this allows for both a big lot in the middle, which I think is important, and it also allows for off-street parking on the side, which I feel like kind of fits in with this more modern style of building. I wanted there to be a little bit of contrast with the parking lots here, so the bigger office has a slightly nicer looking parking lot, if you can say that, and then the smaller one has just this dinky little lot where you just drive right off the street into a parking spot. I'm sure you know this very weird sort of parking lot. But I feel like it just fits this kind of lower density, smaller, probably a little bit less prosperous building. This whole complex is meant to look like it was built on a lot that was vacant until quite recently. So I added a little remnant of that here along the driveway using the same technique as before with the big decal, plus some grass sprites sprinkled on top that I guess they haven't bothered mowing for whatever reason. I found out at this point that you can actually recolor grass props, which makes sense when you think about it. They're just props, and you can recolor other props. So I feel like that might actually be something that I end up spending a lot of time on in the future to get more realistic kinds of lots like this as we move through the series, but that's not important right now. So even though these are meant to be offices, I guess that they're really more of a mix between office and industrial because they have these kinds of yards or lots or whatever you want to call them out back that look a bit more on the industrial side of things. So maybe they're like businesses that have lots of administrative jobs, but then they also have kind of like a shipping department or something. Someone should make a TV show about that, like an office where they have never mind. The bigger office has a couple of truck bays out back, and for some reason they are storing a bunch of pallets of stuff outside, which maybe doesn't seem like a good idea in a place that gets lots of snow, but it is summer here, so I think it's excusable. And to represent some activity here, I'm going to clip an industrial block into the back of the office to generate a little bit of production and jobs and some traffic. And the big office building around front is functional already, so that's going to provide the office jobs for this complex. For the office across the street, we're going to turn to Duluth for inspiration, looking at this big chunky building, which seems to be a public works office that houses some various city services. I struggled to find the right kind of big, really bulky asset for this build, but I eventually noticed that this building in Duluth has a lot of similar architectural features to a modern school, or at least a suburban style of school. So I downloaded this modular school pack and clipped together a couple of the largest pieces to make something that will fit into this plot of land. Of course, leaving some generous space around it for a parking lot and some garage access as well. I think that the asset itself does most of the talking here in terms of details, but I did want to give it a little bit of help to blend into the environment by adding some of these concrete props along the base of the building where people need to walk to get from their parking spot to the nearest entrance, and then filling some of the gaps in between these props where you don't need walking space with some grass landscaping. This was kind of a nicely old school build. It reminded me of like playing the game back in like 2018 before I had like PO or anything. Just using all these classic King Leno props and not turning anything into a PO, not doing much IMT, although I did do a little bit over here just to add some grass and clean up the border of the parking lot. It's just a lot easier to do it that way than with props for the most part. Because this is meant to be a public works office, I wanted a decent amount of relevant traffic coming and going. So I clipped an industrial block around back in the garage area and set it to spawn mostly generic vehicles that you could imagine maybe are delivering materials for whatever projects they have going on here. It's not really meant to be a productive industrial building. It's mostly here just to generate traffic. Then of course, around front, I'm going to add a few office blocks to bring in administrative jobs. Finally, over on the corner, there was this single garage door built into one of the assets, so I figured that I might as well add something over here. And this time I opted for a road maintenance vehicle service block, which I will clip in just a second, and a lot to go alongside that. I set it to pop out these generic-looking maintenance vehicles. I don't think this is really going to be the city's main street maintenance hub. We'll probably have something like that elsewhere if I remember to build that, but this is just to have a little bit of activity coming and going. Despite having the giant parking lot alongside this giant building, I thought it would be appropriate to also have a streetcar stop here. It's also kind of halfway between the previous stop over by the historic industrial zone and the other one, which I think is by the bus depot. So I'm gonna get a little stop here, and hopefully that'll dissuade people from using this kind of depressing parking lot. Now to put the other piece of bread on this historic industrial zone sandwich, I guess you could call it, we're going to do another bulky build, this time on the more heavily industrial side of the scale. For this one, we will once again look to Duluth for inspiration, this time heading over to this building that houses a company called Bentech, which apparently bends pipes. That's their whole thing. And before doing this build, I had absolutely no idea that pipe bending was a thing at this scale, but I think it kind of makes sense when you think about it, I guess. Anyway, I wanted to make a building with a similar kind of T-shape to the inspiration, so as usual, I went back to my PO addiction to take the closest building that I had in my collection, which was this warehouse, and changing the proportions so that it looks a bit more imposing and like you could fit massive pipes inside of it. I don't believe that the Duluth facility has a rail spur, at least I didn't see one, but since we have the main line right here, I decided to add one to our version. And it's a pretty nice spot for that because you do have the dead end of the road here, so there's no level crossing needed. I didn't think that I could run the track directly into the facility or into the building itself without making the curve too sharp, so the logistics are going to end up being a little bit weird. My thought was that they will load up vehicles from the rail cars using a crane over here, and then the truck that it's loaded onto will maneuver the payload wherever it needs to go in the building. And of course, the inverse is also true for if they're shipping something out. It looks like the real-life thing has a couple of gantry cranes to do this kind of thing, so I used this asset to get that look and then detailed up a little scene underneath with the cars with the pipes in them, which I think these are called bulkhead cars, but I also get lots of rail stuff wrong, so I could be wrong. And then there's a hilariously undersized trailer next to it ready to accept these giant pipes. Obviously, this is a little awkward because there are these garage doors that are perpendicular to the loading area, so my thought was that those would be blocked off when there's a delivery, and then they'd open it all up when there's no delivery from the train going on. That might not be the most realistic setup, but I think it's going to look good enough if you just squint a little bit during the cinematics. But to make up for that, there is another smaller crane over here, just for trucks, so they'd be able to come and go from this side of the building at any time, even when there is a bunch of railcar shenanigans in the way in the other loading area. In order to generate some traffic on this end, I clipped a warehouse service block into one of the garages and set it to only spawn empty lowboy trailers. Anyway, there's kind of an interesting little addition on the side of the building in Duluth that has these distinctive blue roofs, which I think is going to add a nice pop of color to the satellite view. So I'm just going to resize this random small warehouse building with PO and add a color rectangle to the part of the texture that covers the roof, and then run that all the way along the side of the building here. I wasn't trying to match the lighter blue of the building or anything. I thought it might look a little bit too same from a distance. It's really just for that highlight and that pop of color. I used the same technique to add a little garage entrance over on the side, so this could be for like delivering materials other than giant pipes. I wanted to fill in this area in front of the extension with a big parking lot because I figured that this would more or less serve as the main entrance for employees. I also popped in some office blocks into this area to pump up the employment here and stand in for some of the administrative jobs and maybe even the industrial part of the operation that doesn't necessarily need to correspond with a massive amount of truck generation and goods production. For this last remaining part of the lot, I added another entrance for trucks, although in this case there's no crane in front of it because I thought that that would have been a bit excessive to have 3 of them. Here I'm going to put a couple industrial blocks to represent the more directly productive capacity of this facility, and then I'm going to set those to only use those same lowboy trailers. Unfortunately, I don't think that there are any trucks on the workshop that are carrying massive pipes, but I also haven't looked, so I should probably give that a little search. One thing that I've struggled a lot with during this whole port build is detailing all these awkward in-between areas, especially where you have tracks curving over to rail spurs on the docks or in whatever facilities and cutting off lots at these weird angles. These kinds of areas in Duluth tend to look quite grassy, but not generally mown too close, except for in some cases. So I tried to go for that kind of more overgrown look in a couple of different ways during this build. In this case, because this spot is a bit sloped where the road dips down to pass under the tracks, I thought that it would make sense here to have it be a bit more wild with some dense shrubs and even a couple of trees. I did actually end up going back and removing a lot of wooded areas, not just in this spot, but in the entire industrial zone, because I just thought it looked a little bit too lush from the satellite view. So you can watch out for that in the cinematics if you want to see the difference. But I think that a few trees here and there is fine, especially in a spot like this where it is just kind of an unusable space that they're not necessarily going to want to develop someday. Across the road from this pipe place, we have this weird half-moon kind of shaped lot. I had no imagination for what to put here, so I went back to Duluth for inspiration, this time looking at this cat facility in the equivalent location. Not that kind of cat. No. The main attraction in building this facility was, of course, to have a bunch of heavy machinery packed into the lot. So after making a couple of buildings really quickly that are similar to the ones in real life, okay, maybe not so quickly because I spent way too much time in PO to do that because that's just what I do. I more or less randomly started plopping down some heavy machinery, only to realize that I barely had any of these kinds of vehicles in my collection. So I closed out of the game and went to the workshop to download a bunch more. This was kind of an issue because I've been playing with the pre-race day version of the game, and obviously I can't download anything from the workshop through Steam because I have Steam set to offline mode, and I don't go online unless I absolutely have to play like a multiplayer game or something. So I did find a way to download assets without having Steam in online mode. It's just a little tool or program called Steam Command or Steam CMD. So I will link a tutorial for how to use that down in the description in case you're in a similar situation and you want to be able to download assets without updating the game at the same time and then having to restore your game from your local game file backups, which I'm sure you have, right? So anyway, with all those majestic machines plopped down, I added just a sprinkling of details like some paved paths in front of the garages and a bit of clutter here and there. I didn't want to overload it with stuff so as to not take away from the main attraction, the machinery. To get some traffic coming and going, the only option I really had here was to use road maintenance service blocks and restrict its vehicles to be these very generic ones, kind of like with the Public Works building, because I don't think there are many, if any, heavy machinery vehicles on the workshop that could be used by something like an industrial building or even a bus line. But that's also something that I will look into. So I guess I need to take another trip over to the workshop. So now we are completely done with that end of the industrial zone, but we still have these 4 blocks over here remaining. In the 3 rectangular blocks, we will build something kind of similar to the historic industrial zone, but with a small twist. But before that, I wanted to take care of this kind of awkward bit here that's squeezed in between these 2 rail spurs. I thought that it would be a natural continuation of the public terminal facilities to have a big truck cab storage area, which I think would complement the nearby trailer storage from last episode as well. And for this, I really just wanted to evoke the look of this lot in Duluth. At first, I tried filling in every square inch of the plot of land, including this little weird triangular bit. That's not a triangle. Whatever it is. I tried filling it in and it looked like garbage. So I yeeted that little bit into the lake and redid it just as a more kind of rectangular lot, which I think gives the whole thing a little bit of breathing room. At this stage, I once again had to confront my deeply held fear of undetailed bare land. And in this case, I leaned more toward the kind of moderately tall and thick grass. There's also this strip of land beneath the power lines here, which I think probably would tend to get mowed a bit more often, which kind of makes sense. So I'm just going to use these little stubble grass props down here, and I actually quite like the resulting look. I think it has a fairly realistic appearance without being too much work, which is very important to me. Oh, and I also thought that this whole lot looked plain like I wanted it, but a little bit too plain, maybe. So I added a small office over in the corner where I guess they would take care of renting out all these trucks. I think I'll take a look at the workshop and see if I can find a vehicle that's just like a truck cab with no trailer, which would be cool to have coming and going from this lot from a warehouse block or industrial block or something like that, just to generate some traffic and some activity. But for now, I just have another road maintenance block popping out some of these same generic maintenance vehicles. Finally, we have these 3 blocks, which are going to take us to the end of the episode and the end of the main portion of the industrial zone as well. We'll build up this area with a similar set of ideas to the historic zone from the beginning of the video, but this time the logic of the development is kind of flipped on its head. So you have only a few old buildings that remain, and the rest is taken up by bigger, more modern industries. This first one is just a generic warehouse kind of that I tried to make a bit more interesting by clipping in a couple of additions, and I think that when you pair this with the light industrial or office building on the other corner, you get kind of an interesting silhouette on this block. A problem that I often run into when detailing these bigger buildings like this warehouse is that I just don't leave enough space for a surrounding lot. And I think in general, unless you're looking at really dense areas, the properties of these kinds of big buildings just spread out to take up however much space is available. And they use that for various operations or parking or landscaping or whatever. It's just kind of proportional to the density of the surroundings. So I tried to leave a big working area that takes up the remainder of the block, which I just detailed with a succession of various gravel props and decals, leaving this paved driveway down the middle to support the weight of all the trucks that are coming and going, and then of course sprinkling down some industrial clutter for good measure. The next block is going to have somewhat similar of an arrangement where you have these 2 businesses here, one with a long warehouse over on the left, and then the other with this kind of unique looking industrial building on the right. I felt like bulking up this building just to change the silhouette a bit, so I added an office building to the little nook over here on the corner and changed its color to match the trim of the industrial part of the structure, which I hoped would just kind of give it like a more cohesive design, almost like a sense of branding or something like that. And it adds another little bit of a pop of color like we did with the pipe facility earlier, and that's just something I think you need in industrial zone. For the building with the red trim, I wanted to take a leaf from Duluth's book here, building yet another pipe bending facility, because apparently Bentech has 2 facilities on Rice's Point, which I think is certainly an intriguing setup. So we're gonna do something like that here. Around back, I added a big paved lot and detailed it as basically like a baby version of the previous build. So I'm not gonna make you suffer through another long segment of detailing a pipe bending facility because I don't want you to get bored watching me place pipe props. The very last touch for the industrial zone is going to be this half block over here. I'm just going to add a few details to the backs of these buildings here. There are a brewery and a distillery here, which might seem a little weird, but I feel like sometimes in industrial areas that are being revitalized or maybe kind of reworked a little bit, you do find like breweries and stuff because they're sort of industrial adjacent, I guess. I mean, really like a brewery is just like a beer factory. So anyway, we have those and people can come on the streetcar line and visit those. Probably don't drive, maybe. That wouldn't be the best idea. So the brewery gets a little patio. And then on the other side of the alley, we have the very final build for this video. What we have here is probably the most recent addition to the area. And it's basically like a big bakery or similar sort of food-related factory. So because it's more recent and it's going to be more car-centric because it's not right on the streetcar line, it has this relatively big parking lot that's attached to a small little shop. So you could go in there and buy fresh bread or whatever else they have. So maybe this could kind of hint at sort of the more service-based economy that is emerging in this area and replacing some of the older abandoned industrial lots. Maybe someday you could even see like a shop in this empty lot here or an office building, or maybe even an apartment tower or something like that, if things change enough for that to be a reasonable thing to have here. But that would be long in the future, long after we are done with the series and have moved on to something else. I had so much fun with this build, detailing on flat ground, which I love, working block by block and just building something a bit more off the cuff than the usual video that I do here. Hopefully that brought a bit of a different direction to the industrial zone, and I hope that you like the final result. By the way, I made a few tweaks to the graphics settings after finishing this build. I just felt like they needed a little bit of an update to soften up the visuals, so keep an eye out for that in the cinematics, and let me know if you like the changes, or if you don't notice them, or if you hate them. Yeah, let me know as well. Thank you to my channel members, and I want to give a special shout out to my $5 tier members, New, Peter J, and Victor Sellen. And of course, thank you for watching. See ya.